Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B, and our objective now is to have some observations specific to the issues of relationships between gender and more particularly marriage itself. Now, we've spoken already about the shoe factory story. It was kind of hokey and silly, I get it, and all of that. But I use that story as a way to try to talk about the challenges of the Industrial Revolution. Let's now continue and even move beyond our conversation yesterday. There's a lot of ways to talk about that story. We could talk about the cultural dynamics of that story. We could talk about the economic significances of that story. We could talk about the educational significances of that story, and on and on and on. But what we want to talk about now today is not only the relationship between Schaefer and Miss Barnard, as our story unfolded yesterday, namely husband and wife, but we also want to talk about what Schaefer and Miss Barnard would both be saying to their sons and daughters about the institution of marriage. Now let's talk about marriage real quickly, and let's do a quick history of marriage. You already know from your study of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet what marriage in the 17th century was all about. Namely, you have some kind of arranged situation. Remember at the beginning of R&J, Paris is showing up to introduce himself to Lord Capulet. He wants to marry Juliet. Lord Capulet's observation is, why don't you at least meet her and get to know her? Dude, are you serious? This guy's asking to marry a much younger girl than he is. She's 12, 13 years old, right? And he's never even met her, which tells you this has got absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he likes the way she looks and he wants to hook up and have some kind of sexual liaison. This has got nothing to do with sex at all. It's got to do with what then? Write it down. Arranged marriages are not about having sex. Arranged marriages are about two things. What are they? One, money. Two, what's the second one? What's the second one? If the first one is money, what's the second reason that you have arranged marriages? Because you're bringing two families together, right? That's the notion of the money side of it. But out of this marriage must come children. That's the second thing. Okay? Children. I don't understand why. What's the big dog deal with children? Children continue the power of the families. So you got to have kids, right? And depending on your social class, the children are for different reasons. For example, if you're agrarian, if you farm, you have lots of children because, quite frankly, you got to have a lot of hands on a farm to make it work, right? So you're going to have lots and lots of children so that you can produce the labor necessary to grow all the crops, etc., etc. If you're from the upper class, you will have children so that you can do what? If they're males, right? You're going to hand on your family line and money as you go forward. If they're females, well, then you got a challenge. Because you have to, from the moment, even before they're born, you're already having negotiations and conversations about what family you will associate with through the marriage system, the arranged marriage system. This kind of dynamic leads to a certain understanding of male-female roles. You could probably write them down, easily predictable. Think about Romeo and Juliet. See, it's a fair question. In the Capulet family, who's in charge? Who runs the show? At least on the outside looking in, who runs the show? Well, notice, Paris doesn't come to Mama Capulet to ask for a hand in marriage of Juliet. He comes to the father. And yet, notice that in the very next scene of that play, and I realize that was 3 years ago that you studied it, but some of you will maybe remember, in the very next scene of that play, Juliet's mom comes to Juliet and says, your dad, he's done it. Later in the play, when dad really does do it and pulls the plug and says, yeah, we're going to marry her off, it's mama who shows up again, giddy. She's excited about the fact that her 12, 13-year-old daughter is about to marry some 40-year-old guy. She's very excited about that fact. Well, how come? What is the dynamics in terms of roles, relationships of male-female? Well, if the father's job is to run the show, what's the mother's job? Some have said it this way. The mother's job is to make sure the show gets run, right? That is to say, behind the scenes, she's also running the show. She's got her role to play. All of that is in play. Notice I said, some of you were thinking I was just being ironic or humorous when I said that Schaefer and Miss Barnard had 8 children. I choose the number 8 intentionally. All of what I'm talking about is deeply in play by the time Schaefer leaves that morning to go to work. They got 8 kids, which is a financial responsibility to him, but far greater than that. From the very beginning, the question has always been, who are we going to marry him off to? From the very beginning. Now, I'll just pause for a moment at a 3B observation. How has this changed today? Has it changed? And if it has, how? Is it the case that today, when a child is born, that the first thoughts are, who are we going to marry the child off to? Is that the case today? Is it the case in any cultures today on this planet? Uh-oh. Some of us will say, you bet it is. You bet it is. And in fact, of course, large numbers of people on this planet who marry every day do not marry because they choose who they want to be with. They marry because this is an arrangement between families, right? And this is just the way that it is. Let's now go to the Victorian period. And we're going to look at 2 texts that analyze this understanding of marriage. The first one we're going to look at is Jane Austen's On Making an Agreeable Marriage. And we're going to ask a question for your annotations, and then we're going to listen to this reading, and then we're going to come back and make a few observations. I'm going to set you up for the listening of this reading. The questions run something like this. In Jane Austen's day, in the Victorian period, what constituted an agreeable or a useful or a correct marriage? Now, a 3B question here that's interesting is, how will you know when you've met the right person to marry? And so on and so forth. But we're asking now about Victorian England. And we're very interested in this notion of marriage as being something you want or something you don't want if you are a woman. If you are a woman, all right? Now, our writer here is Jane Austen, the great novelist of so many classic novels that we're maybe familiar with as films. You know, the success of these films have been quite remarkable. Probably Pride and Prejudice is the film that some of you are maybe familiar with. If you haven't seen that one, jot it down at 3A and maybe take a look at it the next time that you have an opportunity. Some students reporting it's one of the better films that they've seen from this era of the Victorian era, okay? You have a response, let's say it that way, so you might want to write this down. You have a response in this reading, in this cutting, by Fanny Knight. Okay, Fanny is a woman who is responding in a letter to her niece. Okay, recently there's some doubts that have been expressed about her suitor. What is a suitor? What does that word mean? Do you guys know? It's the guy who wants to marry, right? It's the guy who wants to marry. So the whole notion of dating, of coming to try to convince the girl that, you know, you should let me marry you or whatever. She has some doubts about this, all right? Austen not only advises her niece, Fanny Knight, but also comments neatly on what makes a desirable marriage in Austen's social class in the early 1800s. So we're basically talking here, 1800, think of it as that, is an easy working date. What qualifies as a good possible guy to marry? All right? In other words, what is Austen's suggestions here? You'll want to bullet point what those are. Let's take a listen now. Just follow along. What is it that Austen says is probably, to Fanny, a good way to come up with a guy? What is an agreeable marriage, if you will? Okay?
Making an Agreeable Marriage by Jane Austen. To Fanny Knight, Friday the 18th through Sunday the 20th of November, 1814. Chawton, November 18th, Friday. I feel quite as doubtful as you could be, my dearest Fanny, as to when my letter may be finished, for I can command very little quiet time at present. But yet I must begin, for I know you will be glad to hear as soon as possible, and I really am impatient myself to be writing something on so very interesting a subject. though I have no hope of writing anything to the purpose. I shall do very little more, I dare say, than say over again what you have said before. I was certainly a good deal surprised at first, as I had no suspicion of any change in your feelings, and I have no scruple in saying that you cannot be in love. My dear Fanny, I am ready to laugh at the idea, and yet it is no laughing matter to have had you so mistaken as to your own feelings, and with all my heart I wish I had cautioned you on that point when first you spoke to me. But though I did not think you then so much in love as you thought yourself, I did consider you as being attached in a degree, quite sufficiently for happiness, as I had no doubt it would increase with opportunity. And from the time of our being in London together, I thought you really very much in love. But you certainly are not at all. There is no concealing it. What strange creatures we are! It seems as if your being secure of him, as you say yourself, had made you indifferent. There was a little disgust, I suspect, at the races, and I do not wonder at it. His expressions then would not do for one who had rather more acuteness, penetration, and taste than love, which was your case. And yet, after all, I am surprised that the change in your feelings should be so great. He is just what he ever was, only more evidently and uniformly devoted to you. This is all the difference. How shall we account for it? My dearest Fanny, I am writing what will not be of the smallest use to you. I am feeling differently every moment, and shall not be able to suggest a single thing that can assist your mind. I could lament in one sentence and laugh in the next, but as to opinion or counsel, I am sure none will be extracted worth having from this letter. I read yours through the very even I received it, getting away by myself. I could not bear to leave off when I had once begun. I was full of curiosity and concern. Luckily, your Aunt C. dined at the other house. Therefore, I had not to maneuver away from her, and as to anybody else, I do not care. Poor dear Mr. J.P. Oh, dear Fanny, your mistake has been one that thousands of women fall into.
All right, here we
He
go.
was the first young man who attached himself to you. That was the charm, and most powerful it is. Among the multitudes, however, that can make the same mistake with yourself, there can be few indeed who have so little reason to regret it. His character and his attachment leave you nothing to be ashamed of. Upon the whole, what is to be done? You certainly have encouraged him to such a point as to make him feel almost secure of you. You have no inclination for any other person. His situation in life, family, friends, and above all his character, his uncommonly amiable mind, strict principles, just notions, good habits, all that you know so well how to value, all that really is of the first importance, everything of this nature pleads his cause most strongly. You have no doubt of his having superior abilities. He has proved it at the university. He is, I dare say, such a scholar as your agreeable idle brothers would ill bear a comparison with. Oh, my dear Fanny, the more I write about him, the warmer my feelings become, the more strongly I feel the sterling worth of such a young man and the desirableness of your growing in love with him again. I recommend this most thoroughly. There are such beings in the world, perhaps, 1 in 1,000, as the creature you and I should think perfection, where grace and spirit are united to worth, where the manners are equal to the heart and understanding. But such a person may not come in your way, or if he does, he may not be the eldest son of a man of fortune, the brother of your particular friend, and belonging to your own country. Think of all this, Fanny. Mr. J.P. has advantages which do not often meet in one person. His only fault, indeed, seems modesty. If he were less modest, he would be more agreeable, speak louder, and look impudenter. And is not it a fine character of which modesty is the only defect? I have no doubt that he will get more lively and more like yourselves as he is more with you. He will catch your ways if he belongs to you. And as to there being any objection from his goodness, from the danger of his becoming even evangelical, I cannot admit that. I am by no means convinced that we ought not all to be evangelicals, and am at least persuaded that they who are so from reason and feeling must be happiest and safest. Do not be frightened from the connection by your brothers having most wit. Wisdom is better than wit, and in the long run will certainly have the laugh on her side. And don't be frightened by the idea of his acting more strictly up to the precepts of the New Testament than others. And now, my dear Fanny, having written so much on one side of the question, I shall turn round and entreat you not to commit yourself farther, and not to think of accepting him unless you really do like him. Anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. And if his deficiencies of manner, etc., etc., strike you more than all his good qualities, if you continue to think strongly of them, give him up at once. Things are now in such a state that you must resolve upon one or the other, either to allow him to go on as he has done, or whenever you are together behave with a coldness which may convince him that he has been deceiving himself. I have no doubt of his suffering a good deal for a time, a great deal when he feels that he must give you up, but it is no creed of mine, as you must be well aware, that such sort of disappointments kill anybody. Your sending the music was an admirable device. It made everything easy, and I do not know how I could have accounted for the parcel otherwise. For though your dear papa most conscientiously hunted about till he found me alone in the dining parlor, your Aunt C had seen that he had a parcel to deliver. As it was, however, I do not think anything was suspected. We have heard nothing fresh from Anna. I trust she is very comfortable in her new home. Her letters have been very sensible and satisfactory, with no parade of happiness, which I like them the better for. I have often known young married women write in a way I did not like in that respect. You will be glad to hear that the first edit of M.P. is all sold. Your Uncle Henry is rather wanting me to come to town to settle about a second edit, but as I could not very conveniently leave home now, I have written him my will and pleasure, and unless he still urges it, shall not go. I am very greedy, and want to make the most of it, but as you are much above caring about money, I shall not plague you with any particulars. The pleasures of vanity are more within your comprehension, and you will enter into mine at receiving the praise which every now and then comes to me through some channel or other.
Jot down in your notes real quickly what you find most intriguing about this reading in regards to what makes a viable candidate for marriage. Notice already in this reading of 1814, we have a shift from 200 years prior, when in Romeo and Juliet, Lord Capulet says to Juliet, his daughter, "You will marry him, done." What do you say is different in this reading? For example, where are the men in this reading? They're kind of behind the scenes, aren't they? The man goes, tries to win the affection of the girl, in this case Fanny, right? And the suggestion here is to either do it or not do it. In the end, what is Austen's suggestion to young Fanny? Can you put it in your own words? What is it?
If you really like it,
Go for it if you really love him. What does this seem to suggest about Austen's view about marriage? What is most important? Well, now that's interesting. What else could it be? Why would anyone marry for a reason other than love? Yeah, right? We understand it. Now, when we say it like this, money, it just doesn't mean money. It also means what? That's the P word, isn't it? Right? Power, right? You marry for money or for power, right? What are your thoughts, though, about this dynamic from this time period? Do you think it's better to marry because you're in love, or is it better to marry because you have money? And we are aware that when you're about to leave and go to university, so I'll say this out loud. What is the number one question asked by females on college campuses when they meet a guy? Guys, you might want to listen to this. The statistics are all out there. What's the number one question that a female student will ask a guy student when she meets him for the first time? What is your... She doesn't ask him what car you drive. She doesn't ask where he comes from. What's your major? What? Why's that got anything to do with it? What do you mean, what's my major? Why does a girl ask a question like that?
see if he's going to make a lot of money.
Because the major will determine the amount of income. I don't understand. What's that got to do with anything? Whoa. Are we still kind of living in this time where money matters? Do you think money should matter? Jot down at 3B real quickly what your thoughts are on this topic. Do you think money should matter at all when you're considering long-term cohabitation with another person? when you're considering marriage? Should money matter at all? Or should it just be whether the two of you are compatible, really like each other and the like? How important is it, do you think, money? There's also another interesting observation made here, and that is, you can grow to love someone over time. At first, maybe not so much, and then later you can grow to really like someone. Do you think it's a good idea to marry someone if you don't totally love that someone? Is that a good idea or a bad idea? And how do you understand the notion of why marriage ends? A student once saying in class, I grew up in a situation where my dad left my mom and I was pretty impressionable age, and I promised I'm never going to do that. And I said, "You're never going to get married." "Oh no, I'm going to get married." I said, "What are you promising then?" "I'm going to get married, but I'm never going to jack my kids' lives up the way my life was jacked up by divorce." And I said, how are you going to know in advance? Do you understand my question here? How are you going to know in advance that the individual with whom you decide to cohabitate is somebody that you can stay with for 25, 30, and more years? Right? How can you do that? Is that possible? Because people have a tendency to change. You are not the same person that you were 4 years ago as a freshman. Would you agree? Right? And to that degree, if people change. Any ideas on this? Anybody want to take a stab on it? Is there a way to guarantee long-term happiness? Love. Anyone want to argue that marrying for love is the mistake? You marry for money. If you marry for money, then you'll have happiness.
Yeah.
That says that's the way to.
What if your wife,
And when the money runs out.
her brakes go out?
Oh, you just did it like this. You mean assisted or unassisted brakes go out? So you're saying it's all about money in the end. Whose money? Oh, now this is an interesting question. Now, yeah, this is interesting because in Jane Austen's day, the girl brought to the marriage table. Notice I didn't say the marriage bed, I meant the marriage table. The girl brought to the marriage table her family's dowry. In other words, her father would give a certain amount of money to the marriage or towards the marriage. Right? What about if the girl makes more money than the guy in her job? Good or bad? You could have a wife, Mr. Beck, who makes more money than you, and that'd be okay. No problems with that. No problems with that. You would not see an issue with your self-esteem as a male. Hernandez says he'd have a problem. So she makes $100,000 and you make $30,000. You gonna have a problem with that? Because collectively you get $130,000.
That's all right.
She makes $100,000, you make $30,000. Collectively, you make $130,000. You got a problem with that, though?
No.
Until
If she
starts
buys me
running
nice
out.
Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide how the money gets spent?
Joint bank account?
Wait. If she makes more money than you, does she have the right to decide more? Does she have a larger voice?
No.
Oh, whoa! Let me get this straight. She makes $100,000, you make $30,000, but when it comes time to buy something, you get to decide.
Probably.
How much she loves me now.
Because she loves you, she's working to make her $100,000 to make you happy.
Yeah.
That's how it happens.
Well, now wait a minute. What about the other way? If the guy makes more money than the girl, does it give the guy the right to say who gets the credit card?
Yes.
Because the woman just spends those shoes.
You're saying women only go to the mall to shop for shoes?
Yeah,
You're saying you don't wear a pair of shoes.
Well,
You're saying you didn't shop for those shoes.
No, his mom did.
yeah.
So you're saying women go to the mall to buy shoes for their men, even especially their
I told her
sons.
what my mom Of what I
So you're
wanted.
spoiled.
No. If I get spoiled by my wife, that's all right.
It's okay too. You don't mind being spoiled by your wife.
Yeah.
Speaking of, let's go ahead now and turn to 9:16. We're going to shift a little bit, but not a lot now in our conversation. And we're going to look now at a second reading that will be somewhat contiguous to the first, related to the first. This one is written by Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft. And the thing I want to say about Mary Wollstonecraft is that she is exceptionally important in the movement that we will later call the feminist movement. Now, this is going to be an important part of the discussion in Senior English B, so let's go ahead and use the term now. When we use the term feminist movement, we mean the drive or the challenge for equal political rights for males and females. What do you mean, equal political rights? Like what? Like, for example, women having the right to vote. What are you talking about? Women can vote. Women can vote today. But we're talking about 1800. And in 1800, women are not given the right to vote. What? Women are not seen as equal with men. Really? Really, really. One of the first voices that challenged this idea was Mary Wollstonecraft, where she pointed out that from the time little girls start to grow up, they are taught that they are beneath or second to men. They are taught that the only thing that matters is the way they look and their clothing and things like that. They are taught, and Mary Wollstonecraft points out there's something fundamentally flawed about this. Namely, women have different education from men. And Mary Wollstonecraft will argue this is not a good idea. The very fact that in this room right now, sitting, both males and females together, is proof that what Mary Wollstonecraft had to say, notice the title, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. There were a lot of male readers and a lot of female readers that were really upset at this text, because there was the argument being made that men and women should be considered political equals. Wow. Let's go ahead now, and on your notes in front of you, I want you to take a look and write down, what is for you the biggest radical things that Mary Wollstonecraft says in this? All right, here we go. A vindication.
From A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Just follow it
by
along.
Mary Wollstonecraft. After considering the historic page and viewing the living world with anxious solicitude, the most melancholy emotions of sorrowful indignation have depressed my spirits, and I have sighed when obliged to confess that either nature has made a great difference between man and man, or that the civilization which has hitherto taken place in the world has been very partial. I have turned over various books written on the subject of education, and patiently observed the conduct of parents and the management of schools. But what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of the misery I deplore, and that women, in particular, are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state, for, like the flowers which are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, disregarded on the stalk, long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education, gathered from the books written on this subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring than affectionate wives and rational mothers. And the understanding of the sex has been so bubbled by this specious homage that the civilized women of the present century, with a few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love, when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition, and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. The education of women has of late been more attended to than formerly, yet they are still reckoned a frivolous sex, and ridiculed or pitied by the writers who endeavor by satire or instruction to improve them. It is acknowledged that they spend many of the first years of their lives in acquiring a smattering of accomplishments. Meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, to the desire of establishing themselves, the only way women can rise in the world, by marriage. And this desire, making mere animals of them, when they marry, they act as such children may be expected to act. They dress, they paint, and nickname God's creatures. Can they be expected to govern a family with judgment, or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? If, then, it can be fairly deduced from the present conduct of the sex, from the prevalent fondness for pleasure which takes place of ambition and those nobler passions that open and enlarge the soul, that the instruction which women have hitherto received has only tended, with the constitution of civil society, to render them insignificant objects of desire, mere propagators of fools, if it can be proved that in aiming to accomplish them without cultivating their understandings, they are taken out of their sphere of duties and made ridiculous and useless when the short-lived bloom of beauty is over, I presume that rational men will excuse me for endeavoring to persuade them to become more masculine and respectable. Indeed, the word masculine is only a bugbear. There is little reason to fear that women will acquire too much courage or fortitude, for their apparent inferiority with respect to bodily strength must render them in some degree dependent on men in various relations of life. But why should it be increased by prejudices that give a sex to virtue and confound simple truths with sensual reveries? Women are, in fact, so much degraded by mistaken notions of female excellence that I do not mean to add a paradox when I assert that this artificial weakness produces a propensity to tyrannize and gives birth to cunning, the natural opponent of strength, which leads them to play off those contemptible infantine airs that undermine esteem even whilst they excite desire. Let me become more chaste and modest, and if women do not grow wiser in the same ratio, it will be clear that they have weaker understandings. It seems scarcely necessary to say that I now speak of the sex in general. Many individuals have more sense than their male relatives, and, as nothing preponderates where there is a constant struggle for an equilibrium without it has naturally more gravity, some women govern their husbands without degrading themselves, because intellect will always govern.
What do you make of that last line? Intellect will always govern. Begs a really intriguing question. We'll finish up now for your notes at 3B with this question. If you have to cohabitate long-term with another person, better to have that person smarter than you or less smarter than you? Or are the best marriages the ones of equal intelligence? Jot it down in your notes at 3B real quickly. Write a couple of lines to show that you've given some thought to this question. Which is the best way? Smarter than you? Less smarter than you? Or make sure you have equal levels of intelligence?